sure that you have plenty of questions, comments, and also I will repeat Dr. Feinberg's call for Hegelian scholars to reflect upon his ideas. Okay.
So thank you both. I have small questions for both. For Joe, it was very interesting, this connection between narration and dialectics, and very similar. We already spoke something about that, so sort of similar to some my current interest in translation, dialectics, and so on. But I didn't understand what is the real relationship between dialectics and narration. Just that would be a short question, because we can say there were different attempts to understand Hegelian dialectics as narration. I mean, Bildungsroman, phenomenology, all this stuff. But on the other side, like narration as dialectical. I mean, the contemporary philosophy, at least as I know, when the concept of narration was used, it was used as anti-dialectical structure. I mean, narration as the co-presence on different elements, so with any processual or without any necessary processual development. So how would you connect this narration, concept of narration as dialectical structure? So just small. And for Michal, regarding your second thesis, that the revival of dialectics creates conditions of progressive social change, if I understood well. I mean, if we try to apply all that we said during this day on abstract level, how the conditions are retroactively posited, so the conditions are something that come after. I mean, the effects also conditions. Then we can say other way around. It's not only that revival of dialectics creates conditions of social change, but we need a social change for the revival of dialectics. I mean, we need something that will be also somehow Hegelian, let's say, materialistic point. Like, we need something in the objectivity itself that creates, as effect, that creates its own conditions. That means that creates what you would call revival of dialectics, or to put in other terms, it's not only that in order to have revolution we have to be endowed with dialectical thinking. I mean, in order to have dialectical thinking, we have something. We need something revolutionary in objectivity. So it's like, I mean, it will be undialectical to say that only that we need only dialectical thinking that conditions social change. And so we have to do it the other way around. So that would be the.
First. I agree on you completely. I would add another thesis that without revolutionary praxis, the revolutionary thought appeared to be useless. But my assumption is, with accordance with Lenin and Marx, that without that revolutionary theory, revolutionary dialectics, is a precondition for formatting the movement that can create resistance and social change. The social change cannot happen, cannot occur without social agency, and the formation of the social agency needs to have some conceptual preconditions, because the social agency lives under certain historical circumstances which hinders the social changes. So that we have to create a distance between the contexts of multi-layered, multi-dimensional web of context, and a social agency that could change the world?
Yeah, Sasha, thanks for that question. I guess I would have two parts to the answer. One is, I guess there's sort of two versions of that question. One is dialectics necessarily narrative, and another is narrative necessarily dialectical? And to the first question, is dialectics necessarily narrative? I would say that what I mean is that because dialectics, at least sort of the post-Hegelian kind of dialectics, so maybe not talking about the very broader versions of what it might mean, but if it presumes that there's a temporal element and that we see some kind of tension, contradiction that pushes towards some kind of dealing, of working through, which is sometimes turns into a resolution, sometimes into some non-resolution, but working through it in some kind of temporal way. This is one element that's narrative, that's inherent to this kind of dialectics. A second element is that dialectics does deal with the question of subjects, whether it presumes that there is a subject or tries to come up with some dialectics without a subject, like Althusser's notion. There's still the problem of who the characters are, and then there's also the problem of telling the story, which maybe all science, all scholarship has some problem of how do you position yourself as someone who can tell what's happening. So maybe that's not so specific to dialectics, but because dialectics is inherently about trying to capture the unfolding of tension, I think that this narrative side of dialectics can be important. And if we understand that in conjunction with this long-standing polemical issue of whether dialectics can be in nature, I mean, I guess I would be on the side of Lukács and all those after him who say it doesn't make sense to just say dialectics are in nature, not this kind of dialectics, because what makes dialectics relevant to the study of human society is that human society thinks dialectically. Human society has problems, faces tension, and tries to deal with this tension in some way. And when that tension is then retold, then it becomes narrative. If we don't actually think about dialectics and just act and do, then maybe you could think of it as being non-narrative, because narrative presumes that we're actually telling the story. Dialectics maybe only becomes narrative at the moment when we become dialecticians and philosophize about it. So that's one question. The other question, which is a good point to raise, is how to deal with this idea that narrative can be an alternative to dialectics. There is dialogics as certain. I'm not sure which body of literature you're specifically referring to, but certainly there is, for example, the idea that Bakhtin's looking at Dostoevsky's novel as a series not of dialectics but of dialogues. I think that's an interesting take, and certainly not everything that happens in narrative is something that conforms to the narrative structure of the Hegelian dialectic. But I think there might be a misunderstanding of how narrative works. Narrative, even the novel, which Bakhtin sees as some kind of supremely new kind of form that's different from epic, even the novel isn't just a bunch of dialogues. It's dialogues that are brought into a unified whole and work through tension and contradiction towards some kind of attempt at resolution in the end. And so I think I would say that you can't have narrative without some element of dialectics in it. If you can have one thing happening after another, but it becomes narrative when it's dialectical. At least that's my initial thought.
Okay.
Yes, thanks so much for both of you very interesting talks. I have a question or rather remark for Joe. I'm not an expert on Kierkegaard, but maybe I wonder if you can make a correlation between what I would put as Kierkegaard's misreading of Hegel, a correlation to the postmodernist misreading of Marx in terms of what is a narrative, what is a narrative structure, what does it tell us, what is a subject. As everyone knows, postmodernism main rejection against Marx was the rejection of the narrative, of the tellers, of the subject. But what completely gets lost in this evaluation of Marxian theory is that there is in fact no narrative in Marx. There is no narrative, no tellers, no subject, as Marx famously says in the 18th Brumaire, is that people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances. So it means it's completely open. It is not a teleological theory of revolution, as also we can see from Capital, for example, the working day, in the chapter on the working day, Marx says it's completely arbitrary how long the working day is. This cannot be conceptually or dialectically or logically derived. It's a question of the workers' struggle. And this is completely contingent. So there is no narrative. And I wonder if you would say, if we can apply this kind of parallelization of postmodernist misreading of Marx to Kierkegaard, because would you even say that maybe Kierkegaard's withdrawal into interiority has something to do with rejecting something that doesn't even exist in Hegel? I'm not so sure if Hegel really has that telos. What is the telos? Is this the Prussian state? Yeah, but maybe not, So I think, would you say that the critical, what I think could be critically applied to postmodernist theory, could be also applied to Kierkegaard, that he maybe misunderstands this strict logic of the narrative in Hegel?
I'm also not an expert on Kierkegaard, but I certainly would say that Kierkegaard is, he's reacting in a very personal way to sort of the reception, what people say about Hegel in the 1830s, 40s, more than, he doesn't go through like analyzing Hegel's text to say this is what Hegel says and this is what I'm against. So he's sort of reacting to the accepted narrative about Hegel, whether it's what Hegel said or not. It's also an interesting question of to what extent Marx's dialectics is narrative. Yeah, I think definitely I'm completely in agreement in that Marx doesn't have a single narrative. There are moments when he says this is where the dialectical tensions are pointing. Mm-hmm. So there are moments when he tells one story. I read Capital also as a story of sorts, but it's not the story of how, it does end with the expropriation of the expropriators, but most of the story is really about revealing exploitation and delving into this dialectic. It's not the dialectic of the revolution, but the dialectic of capital. And I still think there is a narrative element there, because it's about how it's sort of the temporality of understanding of our understanding, because we finally enter the workplace and see what didn't appear in the world of commodities. So we can tell it as a kind of story, as Marx does. And there's also the story of the unfolding of capitalism. But they are different stories that overlap in complicated ways and are in tension with one another. And yeah, certainly, one grand narrative is a very simplistic way of reading Marx, but a way that some Marxists have read Marx.
Can I react to your
Okay,
book?
sure. Yeah, first, if you want. Okay.
If I can comment your commentary. It seems to me that the position saying everything depends on not on logic of development, but on contingencies, such as the working struggle for to reducing to working hours, and so on. It seems to me that this contingency interpretation of capitalism is can be politically expressed as a welfare state position, because we should concentrate on formatting of struggle of workers for reducing their working days, but we challenge, but we face the systematic crisis of capitalism, which, according to me, cannot be explained only by contingencies. That there is a so-called logics of development that produces crisis, even if there is a contingent factor in the development, of course. But I would say that that is the strange correlation between the contingent approach to capitalism as voiced by the stressing the contingencies and the political position of welfare state. I can't help saying it.
Sorry, there's one question. Yeah.
Who first?
I think you're first.
Okay, thank you. My question goes to Joe as well. It's a small problem. I have one thing you said, because in your comparison of Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel and Adorno's critique of traditional Marxism and understanding of dialectics there. On the one hand, you said, well, more or less Kierkegaard's response is the dialectical lyrics with the, as well, underscoring more the individual and everything. And with Adorno then, because this dialectical lyrics are not possible anymore in the historical situation, you mentioned this quote of Adorno that after Auschwitz the writing of a poem is not possible anymore, or is barbarity actually. But then you said with him dialectics become a tragedy, if I have understood this correctly. And I would see there the danger that this is, one can say of course that dialectics or history became catastrophic, but using this tragedy, which has as well a meaning and has a structure and everything, that there's as well the danger of again injecting meaning basically into this. And I would think as well of the reception, Adorno's reception of Beckett, where he always underscored that this lack of meaning, basically this is the way how drama could work or something like this, but the classical tragedy is still too much structured and has a meaning. It has perhaps there are as well some limits of this comparison you made about dialectics and the narrative. Yeah, you said it has a workshop concept. I can't give really an answer, but this is somehow a problem that I see. So
yeah,
perhaps you can comment on this.
I didn't mean to assert that Adorno's dialectics are tragic. It was sort of, they have some elements of tragedy, but I think your point is well taken in comparison to Miguel de Unamuno, who has a very explicitly tragic dialect. He also talks about it as dialectics, I think, Unamuno, and he says this is tragic and is meaningful very much for Unamuno. This is the meaning of life is the fact that you face death and you can't ever get out of it, but we have to try anyway. And Adorno is different from that. So even though in some respects it seems like tragedy, yeah, I think he is pointing to something out and something else. And yeah, I didn't quite get there, but maybe maybe the genre of Beckett is closer to the genre of the story that Adorno is trying to tell, whether we want to call it high modernism or there's not. The ancient Greeks didn't have it, so we don't have as clever a name for it. Or even a Joyce kind of this sort of. It's a nonlinear story. It doesn't have an ending in the way tragedy has an ending that satisfies someone outside of the story because of the meaning it gives. Where even though the characters can't succeed, they can't overcome the contradictions, but you can sort of feel that. Yeah. So that is all. Yeah, that in that respect is very different from Adorno. So it's a genre that's. Yeah, that I want to kind of open up the question of what genre is this, and or where else can we go in narrating dialectics.
Okay, there's one more question, I think.
Just a comment regarding the last conversation about contingency and welfare state. I think the reason that we are talking about two planes of narrative. I mean, one narrative touches the inherent non-identity within capitalism. And because of that inherent non-identity, because of the inherent dialectical or inherent antagonism within capitalism in itself, not because of antagonism between elements of the capitalist society, abstract from that, inherent antagonism within capitalism, we face an inherent impossibility of welfare state. That this welfare state is facing this inherent possibility is not because there are worker movements or there are not worker movements or things like that. The reason, because of this, I think the other plane of narrative, which is the contingency of, say, working hours, which I agree it is contingent. All these movements are caused by these inherent possibilities, but it does not direct them. It causes them, but it does not direct them. So I think it is very important to separate these planes of narrative from each other. One, which is the essential part of capitalism, and the other one is how these essential antagonism appears in various different modes, mode of appearance.
And if we admit that the second plane, the plane of workers' movements and class struggle, so to say, is contingent, what should we say concerning the first plane? This plane is not contingent. At this level, we meet some logic of contradictions or deformations or the relations that cannot be depicted as contingent. And my view is that under contemporary culture, social conditions, the crux of the Marxist or critical thought is the ability of thinking to dialectics between contingency and law or logics of development, because we are forced to some extent to take one of these positions and think that everything is contingent point. But the really art of thinking or the thought capability consists in the ability to see the interrelation between contingent level and logical level.
True, but we have to be aware that we are not falling under a total determination either, because because the other side of the story is total determination. Part of the relationship is that, as Badiou mentions in Theory of the Subject, that the structural causality does not describe the relationship between what appears in the society and what the society is structured as a whole. But the logic of force within Hegel defines that. This logic of force describes two forces that interact with each other. But this interaction, the way that they interact, creates contingent results at the surface. It's not totally determined. I think that is the point that I wanted to make.
I agree. I see strict economic determinism as to conceptual fetishism.
Okay. I'd like to thank you all for your very interesting and inspiring presentations, as well for a very interesting discussion following. And let's move on to, I don't know, discuss over a drink if there is
the presentation of the book.
We have one more presentation.
We have one more presentation.
Of the book.
Oh, of the book. Yeah, of course.